On October 27, 1962, a single Soviet submarine commander refused to launch a nuclear torpedo. He had every reason to fire. The Americans were dropping explosives around his vessel. His submarine was suffocating in heat. Moscow had gone silent. Above him, the world stood on the edge of annihilation. For 13 days in October, civilization balanced on decisions made by two exhausted leaders and a handful of men history almost forgot. This is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the world was already divided. The Cold War had turned the planet into a chessboard. On one side stood the United States, champion of capitalism and liberal democracy. On the other stood the Soviet Union, determined to spread communism and prove its system superior. Both possessed nuclear weapons, thousands of them. Each bomb was more powerful than the one that had destroyed Hiroshima, and by the early 1960s, both nations had enough firepower to destroy not just each other, but the world several times over. They called it mutually assured destruction. The idea was simple. If one side launched, the other would respond, and there would be no winners. Yet despite that terrifying logic, tensions kept escalating. In 1959, just 90 miles from Florida, a revolution changed everything. Fidel Castro overthrew Cuba's US-backed dictator and aligned himself with the Soviet Union. Suddenly, America had a communist ally of Moscow sitting in its backyard. Washington panicked. In 1961, the CIA attempted to overthrow Castro through the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. It failed spectacularly. Cuban forces crushed the invasion, and Castro tightened his alliance with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. For Khrushchev, Cuba was more than a friend. It was an opportunity. The United States had already stationed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, weapons capable of striking deep into Soviet territory within minutes. From Moscow's perspective, the U.S. had placed a loaded gun to its head, so Khrushchev decided to place one back. In secret, the Soviets began shipping nuclear missiles to Cuba, medium-range ballistic missiles, each capable of delivering a nuclear warhead to Washington, D.C., New York, or Chicago in under 15 minutes. If operational, they would dramatically shift the balance of power. But secrecy has limits. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flew high above Cuba. Its cameras captured something unmistakable: missile sites under construction. 2 days later, President John F. Kennedy was shown the photographs. The images were clear. The threat was real. For the first time in history, a hostile nuclear power had stationed atomic weapons within striking distance of the American mainland. Kennedy faced a nightmare. If he did nothing, the missiles would become operational. If he ordered airstrikes, it could trigger nuclear war. If he invaded Cuba, Soviet forces might retaliate in Berlin, or worse. He convened a secret group of advisors known as EXCOM, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. For days, they argued. Some generals demanded immediate airstrikes, destroy the missile sites before they were armed. Others warned that bombing Cuba would kill Soviet soldiers, forcing Khrushchev's hand. An invasion might follow, and then Moscow might launch. The pressure inside that room was suffocating. Kennedy listened. He asked questions, he weighed options, but every path seemed to lead toward catastrophe. Then he chose a middle course. Instead of an immediate attack, the United States would impose a naval quarantine around Cuba, effectively a blockade, to prevent further Soviet shipments of missiles. It was a gamble. Blockades are acts of war under international law. If Soviet ships attempted to break through, American naval commanders would have to decide, in seconds, whether to fire. On October 22, Kennedy addressed the nation. He revealed the existence of the missiles. He announced the blockade. Across America, people froze. Parents wondered if they would see their children grow up. Schools practiced duck and cover drills. Families began building backyard fallout shelters. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Soviet ships continued steaming toward Cuba. American warships formed a line across the Atlantic. Every radar blip mattered. On October 24th, the first confrontation approached. Soviet cargo ships neared the quarantine line. If they crossed it, American forces would intercept. The world watched. And then, one by one, several Soviet ships slowed and turned around. For a moment, it seemed the crisis might diffuse, but the missiles already in Cuba were still there. Construction continued. Tensions escalated. American U-2 flights intensified over the island, gathering intelligence. Soviet forces in Cuba were placed on high alert. Then came October 26th. Khrushchev sent Kennedy a private letter. It was emotional, almost personal. He proposed a deal. The Soviets would remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States publicly promised not to invade the island. It seemed reasonable. But the next letter arrived. This one was harsher. It demanded more: the removal of American missiles from Turkey. The tone was different, harder, more political. Inside the White House, confusion spread. Which letter represented Khrushchev's true position? And then the situation spiraled. On October 27th, later called Black Saturday, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed. Now, American blood had been spilled. The Joint Chiefs of Staff renewed their demand for airstrikes. Kennedy faced the most dangerous moment of his presidency. If he retaliated immediately, the cycle could become unstoppable. Yet doing nothing risked seeming weak. At the same time, unknown to Washington, events were unfolding beneath the ocean. Near the quarantine line, U.S. Navy ships detected a Soviet submarine, B-59. To force it to surface, American ships dropped small practice depth charges, non-lethal but explosive. Inside the submarine, conditions were horrific. The vessel had been submerged for days. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Air grew thin. Communication with Moscow had been lost. The crew did not know whether war had already begun. Captain Valentin Savitsky believed they were under attack, and aboard B-59 was something extraordinary: a nuclear torpedo. To launch it required agreement from 3 officers. Savitsky wanted to fire. The political officer agreed. One man hesitated. Vasili Arkhipov, the flotilla commander aboard the submarine, refused to launch. He argued. He insisted they surface instead. If he had agreed to launch, the torpedo would likely have destroyed an American aircraft carrier. The U.S. would almost certainly have responded with nuclear weapons. Escalation would have been immediate. Archipov's refusal may have saved the world. Back in Washington, Kennedy made his own critical decision. Rather than respond to the second, harsher letter, he chose to publicly accept the terms of the first. The United States would pledge not to invade Cuba. Privately, through back channels, Kennedy also agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey, but quietly to avoid humiliating NATO allies. It was a delicate compromise: public strength, private concession. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle and remove the missiles from Cuba. The crisis was over. The world exhaled. But what had changed? For Kennedy, the crisis reshaped his presidency. He had resisted military pressure and chosen negotiation over immediate force. For Khrushchev, the outcome was more complicated. Though he avoided war, many in the Soviet leadership saw the withdrawal as weakness. 2 years later, he would be removed from power. The Cold War did not end. But it transformed. Both sides had stared into the abyss. They had seen how quickly miscalculation, pride, or panic could erase civilization. In the aftermath, Washington and Moscow established a direct communication line, the famous hotline, to prevent future misunderstandings. In 1963, they signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, limiting atmospheric nuclear tests. The logic of survival began to temper the rivalry. The Cuban Missile Crisis became the closest humanity